And I want to welcome everyone to AEI and to our very modern and high-tech home. Contrary to what you might believe, I cannot launch myself from this platform. It's actually stable. In any event, I'm Peter Wallison, and I'm a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, and I have the honor to introduce our speaker today. Just so you know, this building was originally an apartment building and the home of Andrew Mellon, who was a Treasury Secretary during the Coolidge and Harding administrations, and perfect for AEI, believed in cutting taxes and cutting government spending, and the economy boomed for a good portion of the time that he was Treasury Secretary. He was also a famous art collector. And if you've been to the National Gallery, many of the things you see there are donated. His art collection was donated to the National Gallery and is still, even today, the heart of the gallery's collection. Before it was acquired by AEI, this building was also the home of the Commission on Historic Preservation, and we have done as much as possible to preserve the original interior in the public spaces. And if you look around, the moldings and things like that were all original, and we've tried to preserve them so that the beauty of the work that was done there is seen by all and will be seen for generations, we hope, as we do our work from this building. Unfortunately, one thing that isn't finished is the kitchen. And so lunch with Chris Giancarlo was supposed to be a real lunch, but it turns out it's a box lunch with Chris Giancarlo, and I hope you're not here for the lunches. But when things improve, when our kitchen is open, we'll have a lunch with Chris Giancarlo, and it will be a real lunch, and we'll sit down and enjoy it together. As you know, Chris is a member of the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, or CFTC, which regulates trading in futures and derivatives markets. Since the 1800s, futures markets have allowed farmers to hedge their risks on products that are subject to weather and the other vicissitudes of life. But futures and forward sales now include many non-agricultural products such as oil, iron ore, electricity, financial instruments such as interest rates and exchange rates. Since the Dodd-Frank Act was adopted in 2010, the CFT has also been a regulator of derivatives, as well as interest rate and currency and credit default swaps. These are all instruments that allow participants in markets to hedge their risks. Thus, the CFTC's work is vital to our economy. Without these hedging devices, there would be fewer transactions, fewer firms participating in markets, less competition, less production, and higher prices on all around the economy for goods and services. It's with this in mind that Commissioner Giancarlo's speech is important today. He's concerned that the CFTC is not keeping up with the changes in technology and communications that are altering how commodity futures and derivatives markets actually work. It's not unusual, of course, for regulatory agencies to be falling behind technological change, but some areas are more important than others, and this is one of the really important ones. Chris Giancarlo was nominated by President Obama in August 2013 and confirmed by the Senate in 2014. Before his appointment to the CFTC, he was a lawyer, a corporate executive, an editor of a trade magazine, and, says one of his bios, a banjo player. He's probably still a banjo player, but the rest of those things have now dropped by the wayside while he does his work as a commissioner. He was also a frequent speaker on policy, legal, and technological issues in the financial markets before joining the CFTC, and during the debates leading up to the adoption of the Dodd-Frank Act, he testified before Congress on how the new policies and authorities of the CFTC were being implemented. Now he has a chance actually to influence that process. After Chris's speech, He and I will discuss some of the issues he raises, and this will be followed by audience questions. We should adjourn, I think, about 1:15. So please join me for a warm welcome for Chris Giancarlo.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. And it's great to see so many of you here and so many good friends that have come this afternoon. I'm grateful for you. And before I begin, let me say that my remarks reflect my own views and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, my fellow CFTC commissioners, or the CFTC staff. And Peter, thank you so much for that very warm welcome. I will get to work right away on that luncheon speech. So if you get your kitchen ready, I'll be ready. Let me say what an honor it is to speak at AEI, truly one of the great pillars of free enterprise in our American Republic. Like so many, my professional and intellectual life over the past 3.5 decades has been enormously influenced by the work of AEI, especially the great Michael Novak and his influential Spirit of Democratic Capitalism, and more recently Arthur Brooks and his superb Road to Freedom. And of course, Peter, for his just incomparable work on the causes of the 2008 financial crisis. But today I want to talk to you about something further ahead, more looking into the future. And it's about the ongoing transformation of global trading markets, from analog to digital, from human to algorithmic trading, and from standalone trading pits to seamless global trading webs. And I will describe how market regulation by the CFTC and other market regulators has not kept pace, curtailing their effectiveness and overseeing the safety and soundness of modern markets. I will outline a forward-looking regulatory agenda that supports America's vital national interest in maintaining the world's deepest, most durable, and most vibrant capital and risk transfer markets in the new algorithmic digital world of the 21st century. And I want to start with a story. A few months ago, I had the pleasure of visiting Ellis County, Texas, about an hour south of Dallas. And in the tiny railroad depot town of Bardwell, population 649, not 100, 649. I met with Bob Beakley there, a grower of corn, cotton, sunflowers, and winter wheat. And as we drove around in his pickup truck looking at his fields, we passed by a freshly cut field of winter wheat. And he just offhandedly mentioned to me that he cut it the night before. And I'm not a farmer by any means, but I thought about that for a few minutes, and I said, "You cut it at night?" And he said, "Yeah, you want to see something cool?" And he pulled over the pickup truck. He took out his iPhone. He gave it a couple of swipes, and he said, "Look at this." And I took the iPhone in my hand, and what I saw was an image entirely surrounded in darkness. But in the center of it, I could make out a series of headlights. One of the headlights was from a combine, which was cutting the wheat. And side by side with it were the headlights of a tractor pulling a cart into which the wheat was being shot by the combine. And then he explained to me that the video was shot by his drone. The combine was being driven by GPS satellite, and the tractor was being held steady with the combine by vehicle telemetry. And I said, "When did you do this?" He says, "It was about 1 o'clock in the morning." So just think about that for a second. Farming, which as long as mankind has been on this earth, has been a daylight activity, is now a 24/7 activity thanks to digital technology. I mean, it's a remarkable transformation in one of the world's oldest occupations. And it's all being driven by this new digital world. So if farming is going through a digital revolution, then it's no surprise at all that our entire world today, from the way we listen to music, to the way we gather information, to the way we hail a taxi cab, to the way companies fund themselves or borrow money, is entirely going through this digital transformation. And it should be no surprise that if farming and everything else is going through this, so are trading markets. Our capital, commodity, and futures markets are going through the same fundamental, transformational digital revolution. And it's altered trading, markets, and an entire financial landscape with far-ranging implications for capital formation and risk transfer. Automated trading now constitutes up to 70% of regulated futures markets, which we regulate at the CFTC. In the cash equities markets, it's over 80%, and it's 70% of the trading in foreign exchange spot markets globally. Automated trading can enhance trading liquidity, increase market access, and lower transaction costs, while increasing trader productivity through greater transaction speed, precision, and sophistication. Yet at the same time, it presents a host of new challenges, including increased spikes in market volatility from the sheer speed of execution, flawed algorithms and position crowding, and the risk of data misinterpretation by computerized analysis and mathematical models that increasingly replace human thought and human deliberation. And the algorithmic trading is not the only transformational technology taking place. We're seeing it with just the enormous advances in big data capability, enabling much more sophisticated data analysis and interpretation, and artificial intelligence guiding highly dynamic trade execution. New smart contracts, which can value themselves and calculate payments in real time. And then distributed ledger technology, which I've been talking a lot about lately, more commonly known as the blockchain, that presents an enormous challenge to the way the market structure exists today. Yet despite these 21st century transformations of our trading markets, the CFTC remains stuck in a 20th century time warp. Its practices and our cultures are indifferent to today's financial technology revolution. Its swaps rules stifle technological innovation. Its futures rules are written to oversee fast disappearing analog markets. And its entire response to the digital revolution is itself decidedly 20th century. In short, the CFTC remains an analog regulator in an increasingly digital world. And let me illustrate with a few observations before I come to some recommendations. And I'll start with an obvious observation. Every day, global capital seeks access to cash and derivative markets that are the most vibrant and durable, with deep trading liquidity that accommodate modern methods of doing business. Capital readily flees inhospitable trading environments for more salutary ones. As a result, capital and risk transfer markets in global financial centers like New York, Chicago, London, and Hong Kong are in daily competition with each other to attract the world's investments and trading. So it's no surprise then that there is a global contest underway today amongst world financial centers to attract a new generation of financial technology businesses and the jobs and the investment that they bring. And it's a contest in which the United States is falling behind. In fact, the British FinTech Center already employs more people than that of New York. And one key reason is the relative simplicity, transparency, and innovation-friendly approach of British regulators. The warm welcome that they've put out is being emulated by financial market regulators in Singapore, in Japan, in Australia, and most recently, Hong Kong. These regulators say to fintech firms, your innovation looks helpful. Let's see how our rules can be adapted to support what you do and still achieve our public policy goals. In contrast, US regulatory frameworks, including those managed by the CFTC, are widely seen as complex, conservative, and in some respects opaque, with limited regulatory initiatives directed toward fintech. Our regulators seem to say to innovators, no, our regulations don't let you do that. You've got to change your business model to meet our regulations, otherwise we'll refer you to our enforcement division. The CFTC's resistance to innovation is also evident in its implementation of important Dodd-Frank reforms on swaps trading. In 2013, the CFTC adopted final rules for the registration and operation of swap execution facilities. Unfortunately, the rules were poorly designed and overly engineered. They were disproportionately modeled on the US futures markets, and they remained biased against both human discretion and technological innovation. They limit the manner of execution of a broad segment of swaps products to last century's trading methodologies. And they are closed to the unfolding science of platform market economics and digital auction technology. They accord with neither the letter nor the spirit of the Dodd-Frank Act, and they remain fundamentally mismatched to the evolving liquidity and trading dynamics of the $400 trillion global swaps market. And it's not just CFTC swaps rules that are rigidly focused on the past. Most of the CFTC's rulebook for listed futures was written for 20th century analog markets, like those that we all saw in the 1980s movie Trading Places, in which open outcry dealing takes place in crowded trading pits with colorful shouting and distinctive hand signals. Well, today, those trading pits are all shuttered and closed. They've been supplanted with electronic trade execution by remote software algorithms and increasingly artificial intelligence. And yet, CFTC oversight is still founded on recognition of these last century occupations of floor traders and floor brokers long after the floor traders are gone. CFTC market supervision and enforcement still turns on human states of mind, underlying traditional legal concepts of foreseeability, mens rea, scienter, failure to supervise. All of these human states of mind, despite the emerging world of automated, non-human decision-making. In November 2015, the CFTC put out for comment Regulation Automated Trading, known as Reg AT. The proposal is a first attempt by the agency to catch up to the digital revolution. And yet, Reg AT is at heart a 20th century analog response to 21st digital trading. Its broad design is to compel a broader swath of market participants that use automated trading technology to register with the CFTC, subjecting them to additional rules, reporting requirements, and costs. Reg AT is regulatory empire building. And it's also a classic Washington maneuver. Force as many additional businesses as possible into the regulatory framework so there's someone to investigate if something goes wrong. This rule ensures that in the event of some future market crisis, the CFTC will point to these newly registered automated traders and call on the Division of Enforcement to round up the usual suspects. Yet registration by itself is not public policy. And public policy is not necessarily furthered by registering thousands of new market participants. The relatively blunt act of registering automated traders does not begin to address the complex public policy considerations that arise out of this digital transformation. For example, what do traditional legal concepts like reasonableness, foreseeability, mens rea, scienter, and failure to supervise mean in transactions that are not initiated by immediate human action, but are initiated by preset programming and even artificial intelligence? So how do we adapt regulatory frameworks and surveillance practices designed to catch bad guys to catch bad algos? What regulatory penalty, if any, should market participants, service providers, and market operators have for inadvertently flawed technology and algorithms? And what public policy would be served by any such penalties? What rules are appropriate to recondition 20th century trading markets and their essential institutions so as to benefit society from 21st century digital technology? Unfortunately, Reg AT doesn't even begin to answer these questions. And worse, Reg AT contains the now notorious requirement that proprietary source code used in trading algorithms be accessible at any time, at any place, to the CFTC and the Justice Department without a subpoena. It's no surprise that this requirement has garnered an enormous amount of attention from firms concerned with the prospect of handing over highly valuable proprietary business source code to an agency of the US government that has a terrible record as a guardian of confidential information. If the CFTC adopts this proposal, I expect the SEC may mimic it, and then it's just a matter of time before other alphabet soup Washington agencies copy it as well. the potential of losing a trading firm's most sensitive intellectual property in a hack of a government agency will have a chilling effect on automated trading and fintech innovation in the United States. Now let me briefly talk about the implications of some of this technological change on retail participants in our markets before I make my recommendations. In the 27 months since I was sworn in, I've traveled to Indiana, Illinois, Iowa, Louisiana, Texas, Kentucky, North Dakota, South Dakota, New Jersey, Minnesota, and Michigan to meet with users of futures contracts. This past July, I was in the tiny town of Henderson, Michigan, where I met with 20 local area farmers and farm service providers. Many of them told me they were concerned about the impact of electronic trading in futures markets. Some of them said they were reluctant to enter into futures contracts for fear of being run over by the enormous speed and trading velocity incurred by proprietary algorithmic trading. I must say I found the conversation quite challenging. As a regulator, I knew that my agency does not have a thorough understanding of the effects on markets by automated trading and the broader dimensions of this technology revolution. I believe the reasons include a lack of quantitative data and analytical capability in both swaps and futures, and the agency's current focus on market participant misconduct over concerns over the overall durability, vibrancy, and liquidity of American markets. I believe that with the resources it has, the agency should devote more attention to troubling systemic conditions like diminishment of liquidity, volatility spikes, participant concentration, and market fragmentation. The CFTC needs to do a better job addressing the concerns I heard in Michigan about changing market dynamics caused by the prevalence of high-volume algorithmic trading. So with this ground-level perspective in mind, I want to outline for you today a new and forward-looking regulatory agenda for today's 21st century digital markets. And the agenda has 5 steps. 1, embrace innovation. 2, stand up for intellectual property. 3, repurpose rules for a digital age. 4th, unburden the US economy. And 5th, champion American markets. And let me start by calling for a new regulatory approach to technological change. I believe that the CFTC and its fellow US market regulators must affirmatively embrace technology. That means that market regulation must, quote, first do no harm to blockchain and other promising fintech innovations using the same forward-looking approach that American regulators took 2 decades ago in the early days of the internet. It means regulators must take affirmative steps to promote American innovation, such as hiring tech-savvy regulatory staff who speak the language of fintech. And it also means giving fintech firms breathing room to develop without immediately running afoul of regulation. It means participating with them in commercial fintech experiments. It means listening and learning how to adapt old analog rules for a digital world. And it means collaborating on fintech innovation here and abroad with other regulators. The benefit of this approach for American innovation of financial markets is rather obvious. What may be less obvious is the benefit to regulators. We regulators must engage in a constant and evolving dialogue with innovators precisely because we need to understand the impact they are having on the very marketplaces that we're charged to supervise. We must partner with them, experiment with them, learn from them, and innovate alongside them if we're ever to keep pace with the digitization of modern markets and to protect its 21st century participants. Blockchain technology holds the promise of an enormous advance in the ability of regulators to analyze trading data, understand financial and operational risk, and oversee healthier markets. It's imperative that we open our agency doors and regulatory minds to begin to understand it now. Second, market regulators must stand up for intellectual property. If the US and its financial markets are to remain attractive for technological innovation and capital investment, then intellectual property rights must be well protected under law. Since America's founding, those rights include the necessity for the government to obtain a subpoena before taking private property. nothing has changed to haphazardly set aside long-established due process protections. The CFTC must continue to obtain a subpoena to access the source code of market participants. Doing otherwise damages the integrity of the Commission and antagonizes its traditional relationship with market participants. Yet we must do more than just reaffirm the subpoena process. Regulators must ensure that whenever market participants provide data or intellectual property to us, it is well protected from theft, breaches, and misappropriation. Cyber risk is undoubtedly the #1 threat to 21st century financial markets. And it's also a threat against which the federal government has been a very poor guardian of private confidential information. That must improve. Market regulators' system security must be no less effective than is expected of the businesses we regulate. Regulators must not ourselves be a weak link in the financial system's resilience to cyber attack. If we're to attract digital innovators to American shores, then U.S. regulators must act so that intellectual property is more, not less secure than in competing jurisdictions. Third, we must repurpose analog rules for a digital age. If U.S. regulators are going to be effective overseers of 21st century markets, then they must repurpose old rules to keep pace with change. It starts with recognizing that much legislative authority was written for last century's human trading and must be repurposed for today's digital markets. At the CFTC, this can only be done by returning to our traditional culture as a principles-based, not a rules-based regulator. Repurposing rules for the digital age also means moving beyond tired, stale, old command and control government solutions and working more cooperatively with marketplace intermediaries and self-regulatory organizations. It means eschewing regulatory empire building. Requiring more firms to obtain government licenses to do business does nothing by itself to help regulators keep pace with today's digital revolution. Moreover, the CFTC must allow market participants to conduct business as they believe best suited to meet their customer needs, not as regulators arbitrarily see fit. Regulators can best enhance the durability, resilience, and vibrancy of financial markets by encouraging more diversity of business models and market structures. That includes active participation by both large and small enterprises, including, where permitted, individual investors and end users. Ultimately, the success of U.S. derivative markets will be measured not just by how successfully modern algo prop shops can trade without disrupting the markets, but by how end users, like those farmers I met in Michigan, can safely and successfully hedge their costs of production. Fourth, we must unburden the U.S. economy. As you know, Americans are living through the worst U.S. economic recovery since the Great Depression. The average rate of economic growth since 2008 has been 2.1%. That compares to an average growth rate of 3.9% for economic recovery since the 1960s. As a former business executive, I know that unbalanced regulation is a major contributor to America's economic doldrums. Regulations now cost the U.S. 12% of GDP annually, or almost $2 trillion per year. It amounts to nearly $15,000 per U.S. household per year, falling particularly hard on small businesses and job creators. Overregulation is a barrier to capital investment that would otherwise stimulate job creation and wage growth. I believe that this new mediocre economic growth is just not good enough. Regulators have to do their part to unchain investors, innovators, and job creators to spark the economy back to healthy growth and job creation. Regulators must carefully consider rules to determine whether they advance or restrain economic progress. Such review requires strong capabilities of qualified market economists rather than just hiring more clever legal wordsmiths. At the CFTC, we must return the office of the chief economist to historic levels of econometric capability if we're ever to ensure that digital regulation does not restrain the American economy in the digital 21st century. To regain broad prosperity, we must foster vibrant and competitive markets that support free enterprise, personal choice, voluntary exchange, and legal protection of property. We must ensure that U.S. financial and risk transfer markets continue to play their essential role in marshaling resources and deploying them in productive ways, linking savers and investors, risk takers and risk transferers, and shifting capital to those who can best utilize it and risk to those who can best bear it. And we must harness our rapidly evolving digital markets as engines for economic freedom and opportunity, the ingredients that have always been and always will be essential for American prosperity. And finally, fifth, we must champion American markets. This means being their fierce advocates in broader policymaking considerations with other U.S. and overseas regulators, including central banks and prudential regulators. I've been an outspoken critic of the Financial Stability Oversight Council set up under the Dodd-Frank Act for failing to coordinate hundreds of Dodd-Frank rules and regulations on America's financial service industry. I've faulted FSOC for doing little analysis of the impact of these new capital rules and leverage ratios on trading liquidity and systemic risk. I believe that market regulators should use their participation in FSOC to cause it to produce a thorough and unbiased analysis of the full effect of capital constraining regulations on America's capital and risk transfer markets. Champion American markets also means not putting them at a competitive disadvantage to overseas market participants. Just a few weeks ago, I warned of a liquidity crunch that could occur if the CFTC and U.S. bank regulators barreled ahead with a September 1st implementation date for new margin rules. I pointed out that implementation of the same rules had been delayed by 21 out of 24 overseas regulators. I said going ahead with the rules by U.S. regulators would disadvantage American industrial and other companies unfairly. American businesses would either face the choice of higher costs or not having to hedge their risks, undermining the ostensible purpose of Dodd-Frank, reducing systemic risk. Well, sure enough, one day after my warning, Asian swaps markets ground to a near halt amid chaos and confusion over application of the new rules. I received reports of counterparties avoiding trading with U.S. firms, and many trades were rejected. This disruption was totally avoidable had the CFTC and its fellow U.S. regulators been less concerned with sticking to an arbitrary deadline and more concerned with the impact of a self-induced market shock on the welfare of American business. Worse, it demonstrated an astonishing lack of attention by a principal U.S. markets regulator to the functioning of a critical global financial market. Champion American markets means no longer asking U.S. market participants to go it alone and take it on the chin in implementing global regulatory reform. Rather, it means standing up for America's capital and risk transfer markets and treating them as the vital national interests that they are. So in drawing to a close, the question of how U.S. market regulators handle the digitization of modern markets is critically important, and it requires careful balancing. To ensure vibrant, accessible, and durable markets, regulators must cultivate and embrace new technologies without harming innovation. Now, there certainly must be effective safeguards on market integrity and credibility and strong enforcement. But those safeguards should not stifle promising innovation and market diversification. Good regulation should not inhibit technological innovation. Rather, innovation should enable better and smarter regulation. The world is changing. Our parents' financial markets are long gone. Tired old command and control government solutions are bumping up against the new flexible digital economy. It's time for government agencies like the CFTC to embrace innovation, champion intellectual property, repurpose old rules, unchain the U.S. job creation machine, and stand up for American markets. I believe that regulators have a responsibility to ensure that today's digital markets continue to serve our domestic end users, whether Michigan farmers, North Dakota oilmen, or Illinois manufacturers. And beyond that, regulators must harness these new technologies in support of healthy U.S. investment and risk transfer markets vis-a-vis their overseas competitors. We must enable investors, innovators, and job creators to drive the U.S. economy back to strong growth and strong and durable prosperity. And we must ensure our markets remain the world's deepest, most durable, and most vibrant risk transfer markets in the algorithmic digital world of the 21st century. Indeed, 21st century markets need 21st century regulation. I believe this is our challenge, and I believe it's in America's vital national interest that we succeed. Thank you very much.
You sit here and I'll sit at the end. Oh no, they've got me. Look at that already. So why don't you sit over there?
Oh, thanks, Ron.
I don't know why that is supposed to work that way.
That's great.
Well, Chris, thank you very much for really a tremendously interesting talk. What we know about innovation and change is that it comes from individuals who are given the opportunity to flourish. This is the word that we use a lot at AEI, and create more growth. And that means generally less regulation, fewer restrictions on what people do. If a Republican is elected president, you could well be the chairman of the CFTC. How would you balance these questions? I mean, where are the innovators, and who are the innovators within the business of trading in futures and swaps and so forth? And how exactly are they hindered by existing regulation by the CFTC? And what would you do about that?
So the agenda I've put forward, Peter, today really doesn't have an R in front of it or a D in front of it. It's an agenda that's, I think, presented to be drawn upon by the current commission and any future commission. And I think its core tenets, in a way, don't have a time period to them. As much as I'm trying to focus on catching up to the new technology revolution, technology is always moving forward. And I think, to some degree, regulators are always a bit playing catch-up. So my call to arms here is to say I think we're falling more behind than we are normally behind. We need to catch up that much faster. Before I went into government, I spent 12 years as an executive in a company that operated marketplaces around the world for market makers. And marketplaces always have rules associated with them, whether they are mercantile exchanges, stock exchanges, or even marketplaces like eBay or Amazon.com. There are platforms for trading, always have rules of engagement in those platforms. Sometimes, however, those rules of engagement fall behind the technological curve, and those platforms then become less serviceable to their market participants because they're insisting upon outmoded ways of doing business. And this is what I fear is happening here. I feel that other jurisdictions that have a vested interest, that see their marketplaces as vital national interests, are encouraging their marketplaces and their market regulators to move with the times. And I fear that a lot of the debate that we've been focused on here in Washington over the last 8 years has been a stale debate over yesterday's markets. So much of the debate is on Dodd-Frank, and yet Dodd-Frank nowhere mentions the biggest transformation of markets today, which is in cyber. There's no provisions in it for cyber whatsoever. There's no provision in it for algorithmic and automated trading. So we spend so much of our political time debating a statute that doesn't address some of the most vitally transformative events that are taking place today. So a lot of what I'm calling to do is not for this commission or next commission. It's a call to the CFTC and other market regulators to take the 5 steps I've advocated to catch up to this digital transformation before we lose vital business overseas. And one final point, it used to be that trading had to take place inside of a limestone building with columns in front called an exchange. Today, at the click of a mouse, trading can move across borders. It's no longer captive. That's why we need to be so much more on our game. We can't just rely on markets be captive under one roof. They will move where the rules are the most suitable and most appropriate.
Is that actually possible? Can a firm that is located in the United States actually subject itself to, we'll say, market regulation in Singapore? Is it possible to do that?
Yes, it is.
And are firms considering things like that?
There's something that happened in the recent past that just never was much commented on, but I think quite bracing, that illustrates how nation states view marketplaces as vitally important. And that is the acquisition of the London Metals Exchange by the Hong Kong Exchange, the largest shareholder of which is the Chinese government. The Hong Kong Exchange paid something like 125 times earnings to acquire the London Metals Exchange, outbidding all other market participants. And to give you an idea, Facebook's IPO valuation was somewhere around 75 times earnings. Now, China is the world's largest consumers of precious metals, rare earth metals, may have the world's largest gold reserves. And if you are a large consumer and holder of metals, what more vital national interest than to control the marketplace where the price of those metals is set? So, I point that out to underline my point that marketplaces are vital national interests, and they do move, and trading does move. Most of the major trading marketplaces in the West grew to their current dimensions during the last 150 years in which Western Europe and the United States grew to their economic prominence. As the East is growing, they're asking themselves, for example, China, we're the largest consumer of cotton in the world. Why is cotton priced in Chicago? We're the largest buyer of metals in the world. Why is metals priced in London? We're the largest user of petroleum in the world. Why is that priced in New York and London? There's no question that as economies emerge, they want to be the venue in which trading in the raw materials and the other commodities and the other financial instruments that they use as their economy grows is priced. They view these markets as vitally important. They will look for ways to move the marketplaces. And we, I believe in the United States, need to approach our markets with that same sense of importance that they have. Some markets, like futures, are very much a domestic market. And one of the failings I've quoted about the CFTC is it regulated a domestic futures market, and when Dodd-Frank handed it responsibility for the global swaps market, it pursued the same strategy it used for futures and sought to, in a sense, domesticate what is in fact a global market. In fact, fragmentation in the global markets has largely come about because the global swaps market regulators are trying, in a sense, to wrap their own home-style regulation on to, in a sense, and we've done that with great harm to the liquidity in the market. We took a global market interest rate swaps and turned it now into regional markets between European and the United States market. And that's troubling, and that's subject probably for a much longer conversation. But what we've got to recognize is that marketplaces are increasingly global, and capital will flow where it is most warmly recognized. Now, I don't want anybody to misinterpret my remarks on that to say that therefore there needs to be no regulation. And the example I often use is state corporate law. In the United States, we have 50 separate jurisdictions to incorporate. And yet, many Americans and many companies choose to incorporate in Delaware. Well, why? Because Delaware has made a concerted effort to be the best place to incorporate, not the place that has the most lenient corporate law, not the place that has the most stringent and punitive, but the jurisdiction that has the best corporate law. The same should apply to the way we pursue market regulation. There was a reason why, up until very recently, the U.S. stock market, the New York market for IPOs, was considered the world's best because it can seem to have the best balance. No one would say that our security disclosure regulations is by any means a walk in the park. But it was considered to be the best balance. What we need to do is take our markets and get regulation around them that provides the best balance. So when world capital is flowing around the globe looking for a home, it comes to our marketplaces because they have the best balance. In the same way that when incorporators are looking where to situate a new company, they'll choose Delaware. It's a choice of rule sets. It's rule set choice. Somebody said to me once, well, if that was the case, investors will always go to the least regulated environment. Mm-hmm. Well, if that was the case, then Zimbabwe would have the world's largest IPO market. And I don't mean to say anything bad about Zimbabwe, but some undeveloped country that has no regulation whatsoever. But in fact, nobody IPOs in an undeveloped location because companies need good, solid, sound, well-tested rules of the road. Marketplaces need orderly, predictable, sensible regulation, rules of the game. And that's what our task has to be as the regulators. What's the right balance that attracts capital? That's the best test. If capital is coming in, you probably got things right. If capital is flowing out, you probably got the rules wrong.
Well, I think what you said was that, at least in the case of commodities trading regulation, London is the largest market. Did I get that right?
Yep. And
if so, what are they doing in London that we are not doing here?
Sure. It's actually fascinating. So the FCA, the Financial Conduct Authority of London, has created something called their Project Innovate. It's totally coordinated with Her Majesty's Treasury and with the Bank of England. And what they do is when innovators come, when you approach the FCA, it's almost like you go through a separate door that says innovators enter here. And you meet with a set of regulators that are in loafers and open-collared shirts. And they, as one CEO put it to me, he said, the UK regulators were talking to my PhDs in, he said, blockchain smack better than our people can talk it. So they have got people that know technology. And what they do is they say, wow, explain to me what you're doing. And they really get into the weeds. And they say, that's really interesting. But we've got a problem because the letter of our law wouldn't let you do that. So what we're going to do is let you play in what we call our innovation sandbox. You as a fintech company can roll out your technology. You can do a beta test. And oh, by the way, we're going to assign to you this young technologist regulator here who's going to work alongside of you. He's going to work in your office. He's going to participate alongside of you. And we're going to actually wire in to your beta test so we can follow it. And we'll meet with this young guy, we the regulators, every couple of weeks to keep track of how you're doing. And every couple of months, we'll sit down with you and go through how it's coming. And 9 months from now, a year from now, we're actually going to sit down and we're going to find out how it worked, how the customers are reacting, and then we're going to open up our rule book and see which of our rules now need to be redesigned to continue to allow you to do what you're doing purposefully. And since the UK's rolled that out, innovation is just flowing to London. And as a result, Singapore, Australia, Hong Kong, Japan have all mimicked the UK's innovation sandbox. Here in the US, we're still telling firms, there used to be an old Saturday Night Live skit. Somebody would walk into an office and there'd be somebody on a computer and they'd say, I'm here to see John Smith. And the person without looking up would say, computer says no. And they'd say, well, John Smith works here. Computer says no. I think right now what happens is you go to regulators and they look in their rule book and they say, rule book says no. No, go away, rule book says no. And we've got to change that culture. It can't be that rules that were written decades ago for analog markets prevent new thinking, new innovation from taking place today simply because we don't have the wherewithal to relook at those rules. What was the original purpose behind the rules? And how do we repurpose them to meet those principles but still allow for innovation? We've got to get this right.
The regulation is actually done at the market level. It's done at individual places like CME, for example, in Chicago. It would seem to me that even if the CFTC has a method for trying to open up things, how do you get the individual market actors, the ones that regulate the markets, and it's a kind of form of self-regulation, if I understand it correctly, how do you get them to make these decisions and open up their markets in a way that they've not done in the past?
So, Peter, you've been so busy since 2008 explaining for all of us what went wrong and perhaps where Dodd-Frank misapplied the lessons learned. No doubt you haven't been able to follow how we at the CFTC misimplemented the instructions we got. But in the old classical understanding of the role of platform operators like CME and the role of regulators, indeed it was for the platform operators to set out the rules of how to operate that platform. And it was for regulators to look at those rules and say, yeah, they meet broad principles, go ahead. But what happened in the last few years in implementing the swaps reforms is the CFTC decided, you know what, we're actually not going to listen to those platform operators as to how they do business. We're going to tell them what platform operation to use. And the CFTC looked in its, there's an old urban legend that in 1899, a U.S. Patent Office official named Charles Duell said, stop, everything that's been invented has now been invented, we don't need any more patents. Now, it turns out that it's not really what happened, but that's an old urban myth. Well, in a similar way, the CFTC said, stop, we've designated 2 technologies that for now and forevermore will be the only technology that you can use for the most liquid swaps products. And it designated central limit order book, which is basically what the exchanges use, and then a technology that's pretty much used by dealer firms to speak to their customers called request for quote. Those 2 technologies are not written in the stars. I mean, they're totally blind to the new auction-based technology that's just sweeping everything we do, from Uber to eBay to everything. Nope, sorry, auction technology need not apply. Everything has got to be either RFQ or central limit order book. And so, yes, you're absolutely right in the traditional and sound way of thinking about it is that it's for the platform operators to design their platforms as they believe best meet the needs of their market participants and their patrons. But yet, in the last few years, the CFTC superseded that and said, no, we'll tell you what type of technology should be utilized in this, multi-$100 trillion global swaps market. And none of our foreign regulators have followed that example. So in Europe, they don't tell swaps platforms what technology to use. It's called means of execution. In fact, Congress didn't even say so. In Title VII of the Dodd-Frank Act, Congress said that swaps execution facilities can use any means of interstate commerce. So how we got from any means of interstate commerce to no, just 2 means of execution is unfortunately a big mistake. But it's because I think regulators have forgotten the rightful role of regulation. It is for platform operators to design their systems. It's for regulators to make sure that those systems, that the self-regulatory organizations police them properly, and that they stay on the job. And there's another element to this. One of the reasons I mentioned my tours around the country is we cannot forget that a number of our markets have a retail component as well. And retail market participants are highly concerned that that marketplace operators may not have them as a central focus. And this has been a concern in the equities markets, that more high volume traders have been advantaged over small volume individuals. And that remains a mission for regulators, that if the platform operators are not looking out for the individual market participants, then it does come to the regulators at the end of the day to step in And the more I travel around the country, I realize remains a vital mission of us here in Washington. We can't lose sight of that.
But you have to convey, I guess, to the platform operators, as you call them, that these new ideas that may be coming along should be received,
Indeed.
should be understood sympathetically, if I understand that. So the English model, which is apparently centralized in one place, doesn't necessarily work here. You'd have to make sure that the various platform operators adopt the same kinds of receptive ideas that you are suggesting is the way to get innovation working.
Well, I think the platform operators have a natural commercial interest to innovate, to keep pace with their overseas competitors. I just, the important thing is that we regulators don't get in their way of doing that.
I think it's actually time for there to be some questions from the audience, so we'll start over here. Ryan, do you have the mic? Okay. Would you please introduce yourself and ask your question?
J.W. Verrett from Scalia Law. I want to ask Commissioner Giancarlo about optional federal chartering. There's a debate going on at the OCC right now about this. On the one hand, I'm sympathetic to the fintech industry. They want an optional OCC charter. They see a benefit of preempting 50 state regs. They see the UK approach, where there's something I think was part of what you're describing, fintech lenders can obtain. On the other hand, I'm worried when the OCC talks about responsible innovation. I'm worried about when the OCC already talks about we see fintech as partnering with existing banks and the obvious regulatory barriers to entry there that are possible. So what's your take on optional federal chartering, not just in banking, but broadly? How can we make it work in a pro-market way? And then second parter, the Martin Act. Does that have to be part of this discussion? Responsible reform of the Martin Act, whether through federal preemption or something. Those AGs sometimes think they're national regulators, and they're not. So is that a part of this as well? So,
one of the things I've learned in my 2 years at the Commission is not to get over my own skis, and that is I feel I have a duty to call out my own agency when it goes off-piste, as the French would say, or piste. But I'd be a little reluctant to speak to maybe OCC or even the New York Division of Financial Regulation, the reorganized division. What I would say is this. If innovators feel that before they even start, they have to meet a regulator's notion of reasonableness, they may be very reluctant to go down the innovation route for running afoul of that. That's a very broad standard and may change depending on what yesterday's headline was. I think the British have this right. They don't have any precondition that the innovation meet a standard of reasonableness. They just say, come in, let's talk about it. Let's roll it out slowly and in stages, and as we understand what benefits it may offer, we will adjust our regulations. And I think that my advocacy for the CFTC would be that should be our approach as well. We should not tell regulators that there's some preconditions of meeting a subjective standard before they can even fill out an application form. I think it should be the opposite. If there's if you believe there's a commercial demand for what you want to do, let's see it, and let's work with you as we go along.
Thank you. Other questions in the back?
Good afternoon, Joyce Cacho at Anura Advisory, personal company not registered in Delaware. You touched on this a bit. I come originally from the ag space. I'm a land grant educated gal. And you started talking about your trip around the country and the retail responsibilities of the platforms. And one of the observations, domestically and internationally, is that a lot of these commodities, ag in particular, are not being traded, if you will. The market isn't being made by users. it is in fact being made by investors. So their interest is the money, as opposed to many of the other things that a manufacturer of a food item or a bioenergy item may be interested in. And I bring that up because I would greatly appreciate your saying some more about the switch in the market from user dominated, if you will, especially in that has huge implications, to investor dominated.
Sure. So if I could take a moment with that. Sometimes I think that there's a perception that there was a period in time in our markets where it was only farmer A trading with farmer B, and there was never an investor or a speculator. But there have been speculators in markets. In fact, without speculation, you wouldn't have markets. And let me just give you let me just paint a picture of what speculation is. So, if a grain grower arrives at market on Monday to sell his grain, and there is no miller there to buy the grain to turn into bread, the farmer goes home without any economic benefit from having gone to market. If on Tuesday the miller shows up to buy grain and the farmer went home the day before and there's nobody there to buy the grain from, there's been no economic achievement served, the miller goes home and there's no bread on Wednesday. But if on that Monday when the farmer came to market, there was a speculator there, an investor, someone willing to say, I'll buy that grain from you in the hope that a miller will show up tomorrow and I'll take the risk, the farmer's served. If the miller shows up on Tuesday, but maybe it might be Wednesday or maybe it might be Thursday, but if the miller shows up and the speculator sells the grain, the miller's been served and everyone's been served. So speculators allow buyers and sellers to meet across time. If you didn't have them, then if you had to rely only on users, then you have to get that time match up or else we'll have problems in the market. So markets have always had people that play that role of investor. The concern is, and it's a very legitimate concern, that those who are investors, those who are speculators, have gotten hold of new tools, whether it be fast trading systems or computers or whatnot, and are being able to use leverage, investment leverage, to skew the market. And I think it's a very legitimate concern. I've spent, as I mentioned, a lot of time with end users, ag folks, energy people that use these products not to invest, not to try to get from Monday to Tuesday, but just to get today to hedge their production risks. And it's critically important. And this is where I think government and regulators do have a critical role to play to make sure that there's a balance there in those needs. We've got to get the balance right. And I'll give you a last analogy. I'm a car guy, and I've got a 73 Buick Centurion, for any of you that know. It's a big old boat of a car. It's a wonderful car. It's only got 17,000 miles on it, and it's still up to 1973 specification. I can take it out on the highway, and it runs fine. But I tell you what, over 65 miles an hour, it's shaking. And modern cars that are tiny are flying by me, out-braking me, out-accelerating me. It's just because the technology has moved on. And I think a lot of today's end users thematically are still driving the 73 Buicks, and they're being passed by algo traders using the new technology. And yet, we're the people operating the highways. Our highways have to serve both the 73 Buicks and the new cars. And I think that's the challenge for regulators. How do we make our markets serve all the different users, whether they're driving older cars or newer cars? They both have a right to be on the highway. And I cannot make that 73 Buick go faster by waving my magic. And as a regulator, I can't stop the people that are using the modern technology. So how do we get to the right balance? And I think that's the challenge. And it starts with a really deep understanding of how our markets work and how these new technologies, now these new players are there. And as I said in my remarks, I don't think we yet have that full understanding. And there's a number of reasons for it. I can't blame it on a lack of attention, but it might be a lack of a prioritization, a lack of focus, and certainly a lack of econometric capabilities. Our agency, the CFTC, used to be known as an econometrically based agency. We've moved far away from that. Like so much else in life, we've become a lawyer, and say this as a lawyer-dominated agency, and I think we need to get back to that really profound and deep econometric analysis of the changing nature of our markets.
Thank you. Other questions? Well, let me just ask this of you, Chris, and that is, you're talking about principles-based regulation. It's a wonderful sounding thing. And I gather that that is a way that things are done in other environments, especially in England. We've talked about this for many years. What does it mean to take a system that is rules-based, such as the CFTC, and transform it into a place that is principles-based? How would you propose to do that?
So CFTC used to be a principles-based regulator. The transition came after Dodd-Frank. There's no better example of how we became rules-based when we told swaps platforms how to conduct the business, as opposed to adopting the principle that Congress laid down, any means of interstate commerce, and taking that as a broad principle. What we need to do is return to a principles-based approach, and there's no better way than taking some of these futures rules that were written in an analog environment and repurposing. So, for example, we still have whole categories of registration as floor traders and floor brokers. There's no floors left. The trading pits have all closed. We have to ask ourselves, what was meant, though, by those categories? What was the purpose of a floor trader registration? What was the purpose of a floor broker registration? What were the people that designed this in that old analog world trying to get at? And I have views on that. And I think they were trying to get at people that have access to the actual making of the bids and offers, that have that proximity to it, have to have a certain degree of relationship with the regulator. Okay, well, what does it mean to have proximity to the bids and offers today? That's what we need to be asking ourselves. What was the principle behind that old category, and how do we apply it in a new digital world where there's no trading pits? It's in the cloud. It's a virtual trading floor, and yet there are some people that don't go through intermediaries that have direct market access, and that's what we need to be looking at. So principles-based regulation, I think, is the only way, when you've got technological transformation that's so rapid, and law writing and rule writing that is a much longer process. We need to take our rules, look at what was the original purpose in an analog world, and apply that purpose in a principled way to a digital world.
Okay, other questions? Yes, sir. Wait, one here and then over there. One here first.
Thank you. I'm Trevor Lack from ProShares. I had a question. Just imagine if the CFTC runs away with innovation and leaves SEC and all the exchanges behind. I mean, logically, I think about a trader who's trying to get exposure to whatever sector of the market, and instead of trading equities, they may go to futures. Does this sudden uptick in volume present a problem when the clearinghouse or the person trying to hedge their book has to then go to the outdated market to try to hedge their position? Liquidity drying up. I mean, if you think about a path of least resistance, the CFTC would potentially dominate trading and then make it hard for these institutions to hedge their books.
Well, broadly speaking, we at the CFTC oversee the risk trading markets, risk transfer markets. Our counterparts at the SEC oversee the investment markets. I like to look at it as they help investors. They provide the environment where investors can benefit from the upside, and we provide the environment where investors can protect their downside. I'm not sure that one is necessarily a substitute for the other. So I'm not really worried about a regulatory arbitrage that would come about because one regulatory agency moves forward more rapidly in catching up with innovation than another. In fact, in my experience, sometimes regulators watch what others do and follow along if they think it's a good idea. And I actually worry that the SEC would follow, I think, our wrong approach to source code escrow. Similarly, I think if we actually get it right on that, then I think that could have a very good influence on the SEC. So I think that the virtue in moving forward with 21st century regulation at the CFTC is that it would become an example for other market regulators to follow. And that's certainly my hope. And that's, in putting forward this agenda, although it's focused on the CFTC, I hope it becomes something that perhaps others might follow, and we can do that across the board. And Peter, I probably can only take one more question.
And we have one more over there, and that's it.
Well, thank you, Chris, and love the remarks. I worked in the Senate in the 90s when the internet was developing, and the analogy you made I thought was interesting. And Congress took action to prevent states and local jurisdictions from taxing the internet, which allowed it to flourish, and now we have Amazon and other such entities on the internet. But in Dodd-Frank, the Congress limited the CFTC's ability to do things. They limited their exemptive authority to do such things as sandboxes and other things that you mentioned in your speech. I'm curious, is this something in your mind, these 5 points that you've raised, that the CFTC can do on its own, or is it going to require congressional oversight and input, and maybe even changing some things to allow you to have a sandbox to do some of these innovative things?
Yeah, thanks, Walt, and thanks for reminding us of that. There was the 1996 Act of Congress, 97 White House initiative. What's interesting about what the United States did with the internet is, again, there was no R, no D associated with it. It was a Republican Congress, it was a Democrat White House. They all got behind the notion that we should first do no harm to the internet and be a leader, and it's produced 2 decades of dividends in terms of bettering all of our lives. And so, I think we should take the exact same approach. And the agenda I laid out is not a Democrat or Republican agenda. It's just, I think it's an S agenda for smart. I just think it's the right way to go. To your question, I think a lot of what I laid out today we could do at the CFTC without as a precondition congressional action. Although I certainly would welcome, there was a resolution by the House last week, a sense of the House, that regulators should embrace innovation. I don't have the exact wording. It really wasn't extremely well covered, but there was a resolution passed last week. And I believe there may be some other initiatives coming out of Congress in terms of recommending that market regulators set up innovation. I don't know whether they're going to call it sandboxes or something like that, but I think you're going to see something perhaps quite soon in the next week or so from some members of the House. So I think that's a very good step. I've had some very good conversations with a number of senators, including Senator Tillis, about regulators moving forward with innovation, being more embracing of innovation. So, and there's certainly no shortage of fintech innovators that are coming back from London and Singapore with stories about their encountering with overseas regulators and how welcoming they are. So I think it should be a call to action. I'm optimistic that this could gain some steam, and I'd like to see us at the CFTC take a lead in this.
Well, Chris, thank you so much for a very enlightening speech, and the answers to the questions were very helpful. So I appreciate it, and let's give a warm response. To have you back again, and all of you too.